Okay, so we are getting ready to dive into our next form of the Greek verb, and in your textbook, we're in chapter 22. We're going to just do like we've been doing. I'll go through the slides, and then we'll stop occasionally, look through the textbook. So if you are not accustomed to following along in your textbook, I would recommend that you pause this recording and get your textbook, and let's go to chapter 22. All right, so we're moving into a new phase of the verb, and we're going to be learning aorist indicative. It's just another form of the past. So looking at, well, let's see. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and I'm going to change something. Give me a second here. And okay, it's easier for me to get through the slides when I do it this way. All right, so um, we're gonna be learning aorist indicative. It shouldn't come as any surprise. We're going to look at the English first. So in English, when we talk about things that happened in the past, we have a regular form of the past tense verb, and we have an irregular form of the past tense verb. And so the regular form would be to take the verb and maybe drop a letter, and what would be a connecting vowel in Greek. You drop a letter, add ed, and you come up with the regular form of the past tense verb. So instead of study, you would say studied, and that indicates an action that happened in the past. We also have what we call the irregular or the strong form of the past tense verb in English, where we change the form of the verb altogether. Now, we don't think about this because we learn to say these words. We learn to use these words verbally before we begin writing these words, and before we learn these rules. But the the strong or the irregular tense of the verb eat is ate. You don't think about that, but what you've done in this case is you've changed the form of the word. You've lengthened the E to the A sound, and you've changed the ending. So, so in the EA, you've lengthened it to A, and then you've added an E, because in English, to lengthen the vowel on the front of the word, you add an E. Those are all rules that we just don't think about, but we do them seamlessly because we learn to speak English before we learn to write English or learn the rules. So the meaning is essentially the same, and we're going to make up a word here. So swimmed, not a word, but if you add ed to swim, swimmed is the same as swam. So eated, which is not a word, would be the same as ate. It's just that they're formed differently, based on phonetics, based on grammar rules, things like that. Well, in Greek, we have another form here of the past tense that we're going to call the aorist. And I'll just take this directly from Mounce's textbook. The aorist tense describes a perfective action that normally occurs in the past. So the aorist tells you the action that happened, but really nothing about the aspect. And if you need a review of aspect, you can see section 15.9. If you don't know what that means, that is chapter 15, section 9. So you probably can see, if you're looking in your textbook on page 240, you can see that what I just went over is section 22.1. So chapter 22, section 1. So if you need a review of aspect, you can see 15.9 for that. So there is two forms of the aorist. There's the first aorist, which is the regular. Remember, that's adding ed in the English. And there's the second aorist, which is the irregular. Now, the good news is that in the irregular or the second aorist, which we're going to learn first, we're going to learn second aorist first because it's easier in some ways because you have those endings that you can recognize. So it have the same endings as the imperfect. But I'm going to warn you, for a lot of the verbs that you've learned, I don't think you've learned ballo yet, means I throw, but a lot of the verbs that you're learning or that you've learned in this course, you've learned in the present active indicative. I throw, ballo, I throw. And so you learn that form of the verb first. You get accustomed to that. In reality, ballo, which you'll learn 20 vocabulary words this week, beta, alpha, lambda, lambda, omega. What would be ballo if it were to be in English? Beta, alpha, lambda, lambda, those two lambdas. So that's the form of that verb you're learning. It's actually not, that's a modified form of that verb stem. That verb stem, the correct version or the regular version, if you want to say, of that stem is actually only one lambda. So a lot of the verbs you've learned in an irregular form, or a modified form, I should say, not irregular, a modified form. And so the form that we're introducing in Aorist is going to look different in some ways than the form that you've learned. So you're going to have to really lean on the rules that we've learned up to this point for what we do when we put verbs together. For instance, let's look at the second aorist indicative. This would be how you form the second aorist indicative. So the first thing you're going to look for is the augment or that prefix, and that prefix is going to follow the same rules as the imperfect. We'll look at those rules in just a minute in a couple of slides. But you're going to have an augment. In this case, if you look down at the bottom of the slide, you see the epsilon. So you have the augment, that's the epsilon. And then you have the aorist active tense stem, which is the lambda, alpha, beta, lob, elob. That's not how you say that, but then you have the connecting vowel, the omicron, and then you have that active personal ending, which creates elabomen, or elabomen, if you want to say it that way. So that's how we're going to, and this is, if you want to look in your book, this is section 22.5. So essentially what you have with the aorist, the second aorist active indicative, is you have the imperfect endings with the addition of the augment. So if you learned chapter 21, chapter 21, which is our last chapter, if you learned those imperfect endings, then all you're doing is you're adding the augment, and then you're going to have to learn those second aorist verbal roots or verbal stems. But I'll show you where to look for that. There's a place in the back of your book that lists all of those forms. So here is the paradigm for the second aorist active indicative. I would encourage you to, in the section introducing these chapters. Let's see if I can give you a page number really quickly. So he gives a section overview on page 221 of the aorist. And there's some pretty good in these introductory sections. I always skip over the introductory sections for you, but in these introductory sections, he gives quite a bit of sort of anecdotal information. And you're going to be learning second aorist active indicative, and you're going to be learning second aorist middle in this lesson. And you're going to translate them the same, but the active and the middle are not the same. So if you want to get in the weeds of what the middle means, that'll help you with your exegetical work, I would encourage you to really dig in and kind of see what that means, because there's actually a shift in New Testament Greek scholarship that's looking at the middle voice a little differently than even when I learned Greek in college and in graduate school. Let's look here at the second aorist active indicative, and we're going to compare it to the imperfect. Now, we're not using the same word. We're using the form of lambano for the second aorist active indicative. And if you want to turn to page 220 or to page 242, you'll see it. You'll see it here. So to form that second aorist active indicative, you're going to use an augment and a personal ending. So you can see that lambano, right? It becomes ilaban, I took. Ilabes, you took. So it's first, second, third person singular. So just as a reminder, ilaban would be first person singular. Ilabes would be second person singular. Ilabe or ilaban, you'll see that sometimes depending on what comes next. If you remember those rules, the word that comes next will determine whether or not there's a nu. It's called a movable nu. I'm sure you remember that. But ilabe or ilaban, that is third person singular, he took. And then your plural, first, second, third plural is elabaman or elabaman, elabete, elaban. Now, if you compare that to the imperfect, it's very similar to the imperfect, the same personal endings. So that's I took, you took, he took, we took, you took, they took. So that is your second aorist active indicative. And just as a way of reminder, the rules for the augment in the second aorist are the same as the imperfect indicative, which is that if a verb begins with a consonant, so if the stem begins with a consonant, then you're going to add an epsilon. If the verb begins with a vowel, then you're going to lengthen that vowel. So, for instance, an alpha becomes an eta. And I'm going to tell you that may be one of the ways that helps you with translation. Sometimes when we're translating sentences, we open up the quiz or test or whatever we're doing, and you see all these Greek words, and panic sets in. Oh no. First of all, take all of those words one at a time, just one at a time. Look for those stems that you recognize. And if you see an alpha and eta, or you see a lengthened vowel, you may not recognize this word with the alpha. And so maybe you don't think you recognize the word, but start paying attention to sounds. Because remember, we're reading and writing Greek. We're not speaking Greek, but these lengthened vowels really are part of the phonetics of Greek. And so learn to pay attention that if you see an eta, that's a lengthened alpha. And you got a whole list. We've covered them in previous chapters. You got a whole list of lengthened vowels. You can look back. I don't know the section, but you can look back on that. But that is the second aorist active indicative. Again, first, second, third person singular is elaban, elabes, elabe. And then first, second, third person plural, elabaman, elabete, elaban. And the rules for the augment, if the verb stem begins with a consonant, the augment's going to be an epsilon. If it begins with a vowel, it's going to become lengthened. So if you already know the imperfect, the imperfect endings, then you have to really start to pay attention to these second aorist stems. And again, at the end of this lecture, I'm going to show you where you go in the book to really get an understanding of those second aorist stems. All right. So that's the second aorist active indicative. And it's simple past, right? I took, you took, he took. Now let's look at second aorist middle, which is going to be translated similar and I'm trying not to get in the weeds because I just want you to focus on what's the most important to kind of get through the translations. But if you think about the active indicative voice versus the middle voice, at the end of the day, you could explain active indicative as you committing an action to somebody, and then in the middle voice, either for yourself or for someone else. So again, that's in the weeds. You're going to really translate it the same way. So to form the second aorist middle, again, you got an augment. Those same augment rules apply. You're going to have the aorist active tense stem, the connecting vowel, and then the personal endings. And so let's take a look at that paradigm. And I put in the notes here for the slide. Before you jump into second aorist middle indicative, do me a favor, go to chapter 18, section 18.11 for a review of the middle voice. That's kind of what I just tried to do poorly. But just make sure you understand what you're translating, because if you get into exegetical work later, either in another class or in graduate school, and you start to translate and you begin to do exegesis and you see that a word is in, the middle voice, I want you to be able to understand exactly what the nuances are. Because once you start exegeting a passage, and commentators are going to help you with this, but once you start exegeting passages, knowing those nuances become really important for really deepening your theological understanding of the New Testament. All right, so to form the second aorist middle, go back to this slide, augment, stem, connecting vowel, personal ending. And so here those are, and did the same thing. We put the second aorist middle indicative, and then we compared it to the imperfect. But you can see here first, second, third person singular, and first, second, third person plural. So you've got the augment, on all those words. And this is from Genomai. Let's see, what page are we on? We are on, we're looking at page 244, section 2215. This is Genomai. I think this is one of your words this week. I become. And so I become. So egenomein, I became, just simple past. Egenu, egeneto, egenamatha, egeneste, egenanto. So you should recognize those endings. You've seen those endings before. You've done paradigms of those endings before. You've translated sentences with those endings before. So you've learned the endings. And in the vocabulary, you're going to learn the word genomai, and you're going to learn to recognize that stem, and you're going to see that augment. You're going, okay, I recognize that ending. That looks like gen from genomai. There's an augment on the front of it. Okay, that's second aorist middle. So egenomein, egenu, egeneto, egenamatha, egeneste, egenanto. I became, you became, he became, we became, you became, they became. And just like every other paradigm that you've learned, the only way through it is to write it a lot, say it a lot, see it a lot, until you get bored with it. When you get bored with writing a paradigm because you know it, then you know you can move to the next paradigm. So I wanted to throw this in here to kind of talk about roots and stems in the second aorist. So the stem of the verb in the second aorist, it's always going to be different than the present stem. And if you remember in previous chapters where Dr. Mounce showed you how to tell what form of the word you're getting in a lexicon. I don't remember that section, but the whole back of the book is that. The whole appendix is that. Not the whole, but there's a lot in the appendix. So this aorist tense stem is always listed as the third form. And we'll look at it in just a minute. I'll take you to the page. So the reason, and this is what I alluded to earlier, is because you've been learning the modified stem. So you learned the modified stem first. So it's not that we are changing the stem for the aorist. We're backing up and punting a little bit, and we're learning the unmodified stem first. It doesn't matter. That's all semantics. Point is, it's a different stem than you're used to, and the only way through it is to memorize it. That's the only way through it. So if you look in your appendix, and you can pause this if you need to, but in fact, I do want you to pause. So I want you to go to page 461. After I've done explaining it, I want you to go to 461, and I want you to spend some time with this. But if you look at toward the bottom of the page there, you see second aorist. These are all the words that appear in the second aorist. And so you can see that according to these rules that Mounce tells us about, the third one that's listed is going to be that aorist tense stem. And so that's what you want to be concerned with, is that aorist tense stem. Now we learned we learned lambano. Let's go to lambano. That's on page that's on 462, right? So you see here, lambano, I take, I receive. The first one, the second one, the third one shows you that aorist tense. So you can see that aorist tense is that lambda, alpha, beta. So that third form is going to be the aorist tense. So that's a really good way to learn these aorist stems and to see these words in their aorist form, because these words that are on page 461 through 462. Remember, you're not learning every Greek word in this class. You're learning the words that appear the most in the New Testament, right? So these are the verbs that you are going to see the most in the aorist tense stem. So if you learn to recognize them, it's going to be a lot easier. And just look at what you're learning. So look at lambano, elabon, right? Let's go back up to, here we go. So elabon would be the first person singular, right? So that's the form that you're going to find. So if you go to this chart and you look over at the third word and you see, okay, or let's go to any other word, go to synago, right? I gather together. Well, that's not a good one because it doesn't show up. Let's go to genomai. Grapho, gnosko, genomai. I take place, see the stem, or see the augment, agenomain. Again, that is the first person singular, right? Here it is. That's the one we learned. It's the first person singular. So when it comes to translating the sentences, using that chart in the appendix is going to help you to recognize those verbs. Now, obviously, the first person singular is not the one that's going to always show up in the sentence you're trying to translate, but that stem will. If it's an aorist, it's going to be that stem. So just pay attention to that. Pay attention to those stems, and that should be helpful. Okay, so we covered roots and stems. This is the example I used earlier in the lecture. You're going to learn balo, I throw, and you can see that there's two lambdas in the present active indicative. There's only one in the aorist. And you can see that the genomai, the stem changes for the aorist. Instead of gamma iota, it's gamma epsilon. And again, that chart we just looked at in the appendix is going to help you flesh that out. And I hope that's helpful. So when you're doing your sentences, when you're translating your sentences in the workbook, use that appendix. Use that chart in the appendix to help you identify those words. Because if you haven't figured it out by now, this the sentences that show up in your quizzes and your tests are the sentences from the workbook exercises. I'm trying to make it not easy, but I'm trying to make it so that you get some familiarity. The goal is not to fail you here. So learn those words, use that appendix to help you with your sentences, and I think it'll help you with the aorist tense. All right. Got a few vocabulary words, not a ton. Got a few vocabulary words for this section. This one is a mouthful, and it's hard for me to say, but I've found that it's easier for me to say it almost like a compound word. So it's apothnesco. Apothnesco. So I always say the TH, pause for a half a second, and say the last part. Apothnesco. I die. I am about to die. I am freed from. Apothnesco. Artos means bread, loaf, or food. Again, just to remind you that if you see this word, apothnesco, on a vocabulary quiz, and you certainly will, you absolutely will see it on a vocabulary quiz. Pick a translation. I don't want to see all of this on a quiz answer. So just pick a translation. I die, or I'm about to die, or I'm freed from. Any of those is fine. You don't have to put all of them. Just put the one that is the easiest for you to remember. Because as you learn to exegete and as you learn these words in your exegesis exercises, using commentaries, you will dig deeper into the meaning of these words. Right now, we just want you to get a good working definition. And if there's a definition I prefer, I'm going to tell you which one it is. In this case, I die. That's what I would use. Artos, bread, loaf, or food. I would say bread. Give us this day our daily bread. Balo, I throw. Gay, gaze, earth, land, region, humanity. You can really tell that Dr. Mounce is an advocate for the New International Version because you find these variations more in the New International Version than you do others. Like some of the other versions would see gay and they would just say earth. But it can mean land, it can mean region, it can mean humanity. So in this case, pick one of those and go with it. I would probably pick earth because it would be easy enough for me to remember. Genomai, I become, I take place, am, exist, am born, am created. I become. I love the next few words that we're going to be going through because they're compound words. Ace urkamai. So urkamai means I come, I go, right? Ace means into. Ace urkamai, I come into, I go into. So ex urkamai, I go out. It's easy. These are easy words. Eti, still, yet, or even. Eurisco, I find. Eurisco, I find. Lambano, I take, I receive. Ute and not, neither or nor. Here's urkamai again. Pros urkamai, I come, I go to. And don't get these confused. Pros urkamai. See that row right there? Pros urkamai. Pros ukamai. I pray. So you just find a way to make that work for you that you understand that pros ukamai means I pray. Pros urkamai, pros urkamai, I go or I come. Pros ukamai is I pray. And then puros means fire. Things are purified in the fire. That'd be a good way to remember that. Okay. Now, this is a mouthful, right? All of these aorist. I want to make sure that we keep it as simple as possible. This week, you're learning aorist, second aorist, active indicative, and second aorist, middle indicative. Right now, just translate them the same. They're going to translate the same into simple past. Use the appendix in the back of the book to identify those second aorist stems when you're doing your translations. The first thing I would do is I would start writing out these paradigms. I'd get a whole bunch of notebook paper and I would just write them out until I got bored with it. Just spend an evening writing these out until you're bored with it. And then the next night, I would just write them again until I was bored with them. And then maybe on the third night, start translating the sentences, right? Use those second aorist stems that you learned that you see in the appendix to help you identify the words, at least identify the stem, right? It's going to be in the first person singular, but it'll help you identify the stem. And then just work through the translations. Now you'll notice that you don't have a full slate like you normally do of vocabulary words. What you're going to find that as each chapter goes along, we're going to get fewer and fewer new vocabulary words. So what I'm going to be doing moving forward is you can expect to see all of these vocabulary words on a quiz. Moving forward, in every chapter that you learn the rest of this semester, every quiz that you take, because there's fewer and fewer vocabulary words, you're going to see all the vocabulary words for a section on a quiz. And then I'm going to start reaching back into previous chapters. So it's not that you don't have enough to do. Just make sure you're keeping up with the vocabulary. If I were you, I would pick a day to write out paradigms, a day to translate sentences, and a day to just always be reviewing vocabulary. Just always be reviewing. So maybe you do all the sentence translations, you do all the parsing for 5 days, and then on the 6th day you sit down and you really just go through the vocabulary. Try to break it up like that, and I think that you'll find it a little easier. It's not going to be easy, but you'll find it to be a little easier. All right, so that's going to do it for chapter 22. Thanks for your time and attention, and I will see you soon.